Alright, today we're going to be cleaning a carburetor on a 2001 Honda Rubicon Foreman 500. This has the Honda-matic motor. Obviously we have the carburetor off here, and I've done a separate video on how to remove this carburetor off of the four-wheeler, but throttle cable goes in here, goes in this black housing here. We've got a Phillips screw that we've got to remove, and we can pull that housing there, and I'll show you how that throttle works. As the cap comes off, we've got a tab on the bottom here, sits in that groove on the bowl of the carburetor, and when you push the thumb throttle on this four-wheeler, it's going to open that butterfly. So that cable comes down here, you push that throttle, it's going to open the butterfly like that, pulling more, allowing more air to flow through, and at the same time we've got air coming in and opening up that slide there, allowing more fuel to be sucked up through that main jet. And if when you spray into either of those ports there, your diaphragm isn't sucking that slide up, you've got issues up top here, possibly a rip in that diaphragm, possibly the diaphragm isn't seated properly. We've got your idle adjust here, and what that is doing when you turn that clockwise, it's going to lift that butterfly up. And you see there, this is drastic here, but when you turn your throttle up, it's opening that butterfly up slightly. And now you want to only adjust your idle when your four-wheeler is completely warmed up to running temperature, and you want to only adjust it about a quarter turn at a time. And if you want to turn it, it's going to close that butterfly there, and that's going to lower your idle. We've got your prime plug here, push that, suck fuel down into that bottom bowl. Over here we have your throttle position sensor, and you've got two Torx screws. If you're gonna adjust that, you would check your manual on how to adjust that. What looks like a sensor here on the bottom of your carburetor is actually a heater that helps start your four-wheeler on a cold day. So you wanna make sure that that's functioning properly. Here's the model number of your carburetor, and this is gonna be it's a key-in carburetor, and it says that on this side, right next to your idle adjust, and this is going to be a VE, and that's 6ABA0J1. And that's going to be the model of your carburetor there. And we're going to flip this up top here. We're going to pull your bottom bowl off, and that takes 4 Phillips screws, and sometimes these can be a challenge to get off. It doesn't need to be if the person cleaned your carburetor properly the first time. These won't be too tight and they won't be rounded off, but it's pretty common for these to get rounded off or too tight. If that's the case, use vice grips to pull them off, but then you want to replace that screw. Don't put them back in, otherwise you're going to have the exact same problem next time. If you're selling the four-wheeler, don't round them off, because the next guy will have the same problem. So we've got 4 Phillips screws. We're going to pull those off here. Our idle adjust is kind of in the way, but we can wiggle it around there. Careful when you pull this off, you've got a plastic spacer, and I'll show you which direction it should go, but it's good if you can see it on your own underneath here. So I just kind of wiggle that off of there. And we've got your bowl off at this point. This O-ring here, you want to make sure that it's in good condition. If you order a jet kit, this O-ring will come with it. We've got a tab here that actually runs all the way down, comes out this bottom nipple here. What happens is your four-wheeler's fuel is sloshing around inside of your this bowl here. If it gets too full, it will come down this this port here and come out this bottom nipple here. That's why it's important that you have a vent hose on this bottom nipple, otherwise that fuel is just going to run right on top of your motor, discolor your motor, or possibly start a fire. What happens also is if you've got fuel coming in here, if this needle, it's a little rubber pointed needle here, and I'll show you that when we get into this a little bit farther, but if it's not shutting your fuel off like it should, it will cause fuel to fill up in your bowl here, and fuel will drain out here. Another common problem, and I'll show you this, I've showed a lot of people this on separate videos, is a lot of times down here, these brass tubes here can start leaking down at the base. They don't seal as properly as they should, and you'll start dripping fuel. A lot of times that's what happens if you cannot figure out, you've replaced your needle and your seat, you've replaced everything you can think of. A lot of times these will leak down here at the bottom. Won't ever leak a whole lot, otherwise it'd be pretty obvious where it was coming from. But if there's a few drips every time you go into the garage, or you can constantly smell fuel, that might be your problem there, and that's that's pressed down in there, so you want to be careful. And I've showed on separate videos how to replace that. I don't like to remove them if I don't have to, as it could cause potential leaking down the road. If you have this carburetor hooked up to your fuel tank already, what you can do to measure your float height is go from this point here. I guess I was going two different directions there. If you have this hooked up to your fuel tank still, or an auxiliary tank, when you close your float here, it will shut this needle off. That rubber tip on that needle will close that port, and fuel will no longer come out here. To set your float height, you'll measure from here to your float there, and that's going to measure 0.73 inches. Now, this is the plastic spacer I was talking about. It's in the position that it is because of this tab here, so you want to make sure that that goes in the same position going back together. We've got your main jet here, and that's going to be a 158 main jet, so it's a fairly good sized main jet. The actual jet itself is small, and what I'm pulling off here with a flathead screwdriver is actually the main jet holder, and then the very, very small main jet here. This has got a pretty good sized port for the jet that it is. I like to spray through it with compressed air and use carbon choke cleaner, spray through it. I prefer the Gum Out brand. It's got a great jet on there. It sprays through there, cleans it out really nicely. Otherwise, you can run a jet cleaner up and down that jet to clean it out. You want to make sure that you can see right through it. A lot easier to see through it when you're holding up to light, but you want to make sure that that is the size that it needs to be. Next is the pilot jet, and that sits down in here. That's a much smaller jet, and brass jet as well, so be careful and make sure you got a very firm grip on it before you start unscrewing it, or it will strip the top of that jet out. Wiggle that out there. You want to make sure again that you can see through it. Make sure you spray through it with carb cleaner and compressed air, and that's going to be a 45 pilot jet. If the four-wheeler isn't starting good, it's hard starting, could be a mess of things, but if it's fuel related, more than likely it is going to be your pilot jet. That is from 0 to quarter throttle. That is what controls if that four-wheeler is running good or not. Next thing I do is to put a screwdriver or something underneath of this post here. I'm gonna remove this pin here that holds this float on, and also the needle. Then I take a very small pick, take a small something, and tap on it. Now the reason I put something underneath here is to support that post. It's an aluminum post on either side there, and it will definitely cause damage if it gets hit too hard. It'll break that post off. You'll have to replace your carburetor. There's no replacing just a post. Pull that up there. You can leave this in or take it out. I'm gonna take it out so we don't accidentally break that post off. But you've got your needle right there. This is a rubber tip that I was talking about. Sometimes what will happen is debris will come in from your fuel tank. In here, it'll sit in between your float or your seat here and your needle here, causing that needle to be held open, allowing fuel just to continuously dump in there. So pull that needle off there. Doesn't matter which direction that goes, going back together, but it does sit in that groove. This seat is not replaceable, so if it gets damaged, you are replacing your carburetor. We've got a rubber cap here on top of this, and then we've got another jet underneath of there. And I like take and remove that jet. Make sure that it's clean, blow through it with compressed air, blow through it with carbon choke cleaner, make sure it's cleaned out really well. It's a very, very small port jet. It's a very small jet to hold. Makes it a little bit of a challenge going back together there. So same thing, blow through all that whole area there with carbon choke cleaner. Make sure it's cleaned out really well and ready to go back together. Snug those up. Again, they don't have to be extremely tight. They're brass. You're going into an aluminum carburetor, and it does not take a whole lot of torque on there to seal those up. Pilot jet's going back in. I believe I said it already, but that's a 45 pilot jet and a 158 main jet. And if those are cleaned out like they should, you'll have good flow through there. If you've done any kind of performance work to your four-wheeler, you will want to change your jet size. Check with the aftermarket companies that you're using for performance parts to see what that should be. Hook that needle on there like so. Slide that down into where it's supposed to go. Take this pin, one side's grooved, the other side's smooth. You want to put the smooth side in first. And you can just push it in a lot of the way, at least get it started. And then you will want to take and tap on it just a little bit. Do not use too much force or you'll break that off. But it does need to be in far enough to get this bowl over top of this disassembly. So put your spacer back in there. Again, put that in the correct position, just like that, so that, I got it flipped around there. I think there's two different positions it can go in. Oh, no, I didn't. I just had this flipped around. So make sure that that O-ring is good going back together. Slide that down in there. And now you can set it down right on top of there. Make sure that that O-ring stays in place, especially if you're doing it upside down like I am. I know that that O-ring isn't going anywhere. Take your Phillips screws in, put it back in. Tighten those down. Again, they don't have to be torqued clear down. And sometimes these will not seat properly. You got to wiggle them around a little bit to get them into the groove. Snug these up. And so you don't have to watch, I'll just snug it up slightly. Got your air fuel screw right here. And the way you measure this is to measure how many turns out it is. So this from the factory needs to be 2.5 to 2 3/4 turns out. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull this, and then I'll show you how to adjust it when I go back together. So unscrew this all the way. You've got an O-ring, you've got a spring, and you've got a washer. Obviously the spring and the washer are gonna stay down in there on this time, but you've got your very, very small washer. You wanna make sure that that goes in first. Make sure you got your spring on there, and then you've got your needle there. So what I do, slide that spring on there, slide that O-ring on there, make sure it slides as far down as it needs to go. I take my carburetor then and tip it up. Otherwise your washer is just gonna fall right off of there. If you can set everything down in there and watch it fall into place if you want. Either way is fine. Now screw this all the way down till it's snug at the bottom there. And then, like I said earlier, it's going to be 2.5 turns out to 2 3/4. So snug all the way down. You've got that spring to hold it so it doesn't fall completely out. Half turn out, 1 turn out. 1.5 turns out, 2 turns out. 2.5 turns out. And that's where it needs to be set right there. Flipping your carburetor back over, we've got your top cap here. We've got 4 Phillips screws holding this one on. And again, these don't have to be extremely tight. It's best that they aren't extremely tight. It makes the job for the next person difficult. And you've got an O-ring. You've actually got a diaphragm underneath of there that seals it up. It's not a separate O-ring. But if that diaphragm's in place, it'll seal it up. You don't have to torque these down a whole bunch. Pull these 4 screws off of there, and your cap will come off. I like to keep pressure on it as there is a spring and it can go flying. It's not going to go flying across the room or take your eye out, but there is some spring there. You've got your spring there. Not a very stiff spring, but there is a whole lot of coils there. Next, what I do is take my finger, push down from the bottom, push that up. Make sure that diaphragm isn't catching it all. Sometimes it seals up nicely, that carburetor. If you just push completely up really hard, it will ruin that seal. So we've got your diaphragm there. We've got your needle here. That slides up and down when you're going down the road full throttle or half throttle. To adjust that needle, you take a Phillips screwdriver, put it underneath there, twist the cap, quarter turn, then you can. I like to hold the needle, dump that cap off. And that cap is now in my hands. You've got your needle down below there. What I like to do then is grab needle nose pliers, and you can reach down there and pull that needle out. You can dump it out if you want, but you've got a small washer in there I like to keep in place. Now there's 3 settings on here. It's in the middle setting. There's 3 grooves, so you can adjust your needle that way. Keep in mind, if you move the spacer down, you're opening up more, allowing more fuel. Make sure that washer's in place. Slide that back down in there. You can just drop this back down in there. It's only going to go one direction when you're tightening it up. Snug that back up, quarter turn. Now what I like to do is push this down like that, being careful you don't rip it. A lot of times if you get fuel, I like to set it out in the sun to dry it out, maybe spray it with compressed cleaner from a distance just to dry it out. Fuel will shrink, and different stuff will expand these diaphragms, causing major issues going back together. You want to make sure that this piece here goes into the groove where it's supposed to go. Now I take my finger, hold underneath here so that that sits right on top of there. Make sure that it's going to seal properly. Take the spring then, and then your cap. Make sure that top cap there goes the direction that it should. There's a tab there that goes over top of that, and then set the spring going around that circle there on the top cap. Set it right down on top of there, and then now at that point, I like to take my thumb, put it on top, and then I take a couple of these and at least snug a couple down, one on either side, before I let go of the slide on the inside and before I let go of the top cap. Again, it's spring loaded, so it could potentially come off of there and cause that diaphragm to sit in a position where it shouldn't be. So get that top cap back on there. You could take your finger out of that, off the bottom of that slide if you wanted to. I just tighten these up first before I do that. Again, you want to make sure after these are snugged up that you can take compressed air, blow through there, and see that diaphragm, or see that slide go up. And that tab there goes to the air box, and that's just an intake port there. And then go back together, slide your throttle cable back down in there, turn it all the way around here inside that groove, and hook it in that area there. Put that tab in that groove, put that down there, grab your Phillips screw, make sure you've got a washer on there so that that cap doesn't fall off, and tighten that screw back on. And your carburetor is all fully rebuilt there. If you have questions, let me know. If you need carb kits or a carburetor, let me know. If you have other questions or comments, please comment below.